So my name is Jason Medina. I'm almost 49 years old in December. I am fourth generation from San Luis, Colorado, which again was the oldest permanent establishment in Colorado. 4 generations I say here because prior to 4 generations we were here, but this was not San Luis. So I still say 4 generations San Luis native, but I'm actually 10 generations northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. And with my kids and grandkids now, we are 12 generations in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. The original settlers started coming here in the 1850s. This was the Sangre de Cristo land grant was petitioned in 1843 by Narciso Bubian and his friend Stephen Luis Lee. Narciso was the son of a very prominent business owner in the New Mexico territory, and so they petitioned at the end of 1843 to get 1.4 million acres that was later to be known as the Sangre de Cristo land grant. They were granted a week later, and this was at the end of 1843, so in 1844 officially Narciso Bubian and his friend were given this land grant in what was then the northern part of the Mexican territory at that time, but part of the New Mexico territory. In 1847, both Narciso Bubian and Stephen Luis Lee were killed in the Taos Revolt. And so his father, Carlos Bubian, who again was this very prominent, very rich business owner in New Mexico, petitioned the court and paid all of the fees that were necessary to become the sole owner of the Sangre de Cristo land grant. Again, it was 1.4 million acres. And 1851 is when the original permanent establishment of San Luis in April of 1851 was established. Right around that same time, San Acacio to the west and San Pedro to the east were established about the same time. And what happened at that time was that when they were establishing the small settlements, they would do 3 things. The first thing is they would build the placita. This placita was very much a fortress that they could see on all sides to make sure that they knew if anybody was coming in or coming back out again. So the first thing they did was they created the placita. The second thing they did was they dug acequias. So from the major rivers that were coming off of the hill and going back down into the Rio Grande, they would make acequias that were going to the placitas that would feed them water for sustenance and for their farming. It was right around 1853 when the other smaller missions were happening. So the 4 main missions are San Acacio, which was about 1853, San Ysidro, that was just a little bit after that, San Francisco, and then the church that we're standing in front of today. So the church that we're standing in front of today, we're in Chama, Colorado. Chama is 4 miles east or towards the mountains from the town of San Luis. So the Placita of Chama was built well after the other little smaller churches and missions. This particular church was built in 1935, but it burned down, completely gutted. It was completely engulfed in flames, and it was gutted. The only thing that stood were the 4 walls on the outside. We had a Catholic priest at the time. His name was Father Martorell, who, if you ask anybody here, is really a legend in the area for all the incredible things that he did for our mission churches and for our parish. In about 1936, after this church had burned down, Father Martorell started some fundraising efforts to be able to rebuild the church. So he contacted all of the people that he knew from other missions, from northern New Mexico, and at that time in the 30s there were already some churches that were here in Colorado, but he really kind of rounded up the troops and got some fundraising together to get that, to rebuild the church in the same place with the same 4 walls that still stood, and that finished in 1938. So from 1935 to 1938, this church went into a couple of different phases as far as original church, burnt down, and then rebuilt. So the church inside is pretty much exactly the same that it's been since 1938. The pews inside actually were brought from the church in San Luis when there was a church in Denver that had actually donated some pews. So the older pews came from San Luis and were put in this church, and then the newer ones from Denver were put into the church in San Luis. This church was built in the original cruciform plan, which is it's built like a cross. Most churches, they wanted to face the east because that was an old Spanish tradition, but only the church in San Acacio and only the church in Chama actually are facing east. And that is something that was a Mexican and Spanish tradition that was passed down. So even the wide walkways leading up to this church is significant because in old Spanish and Mexican churches, they had this walkway for processions. So whether that was a wedding procession or a funeral procession, whatever it happened to be, they needed to make sure that there was enough walkway here for people to be able to do the processions, and also for these outside masses that they had a place for the people to sit. So that's really significant that they kept that. There's a lot of churches where you can see where this actually existed, but then they just put a regular old walkway up there, which is really not conducive to having community events and outside masses. So they really kept the historical significance of this wide walkway. So the thing that's very unique about this particular church, most churches, cathedrals going back centuries, have stained glass windows. This particular church, it looks like they're stained glass, but it's actually painted. They were originally painted in about the 1940s. You'll see the wooden doors behind me, totally significant to Mexican and Spanish rule. If you go down into northern New Mexico, most especially, the old churches all have this same style of doors, which is a kind of like fan piece up on top. They're all hand carved. Most of them are one piece of wood, which is incredible.
My name is James Sanchez. Around here I'm also known as El Jaime. I was born and raised in Los Huertes, Colorado, and this is where we're at. This is the San Ysidro Mission Church. This church has been here since 1893, from my understanding. I just felt that was a very cool connection between our family and this church. Our family was deeded our ranch or our property in 1893 by the predecessors of Carlos Bovian. And by that time, we had to actually purchase property versus the original deeds were just handed out to Spanish settlers by Carlos Bovian. So by 1893, Colorado had been established and Congress had accepted the Sangre de Cristo land grant, but anybody who wanted to own property here had to purchase it. And fortunately, my great-great-grandmother or aunt, we're not sure exact relationship to us, but her name was Maria Josefa Valdez. And that's our connection to this church, and I think that's very special. So this church, having been built in 1893, it played a very important role to a lot of this community, and San Ysidro is the patron saint of the farmer. During the years, even though the main church was in town in San Luis, I imagine transportation wasn't that readily available for a lot of people. Even in the 30s, I remember having conversations with my aunts and uncles, my mom's brothers and aunts, and none of their family had a vehicle. They would use horseback or buggies to go to town to buy groceries or what have you. So these churches on Sundays played a very important role. The original thing that's left is actually the altar and the saints. Throughout the years, the stucco in here used to be white. and it was plaster, and it had a white color. But that year, the wind just, it was brutal all winter long. And there was just no way for anybody to get up there and do the repairs. So just in that one winter, the damage was pretty devastating in here. And so, and thankfully, you know, these people, these mayordomos that we've had at this church, I credit them a lot for this church being the way it is. There's all these families. I think every family in this community has at one point in time, including my dad, would take on the responsibility of being the mayordomo for a couple of years. The cemetery, most churches and a lot of churches, or a lot of places that I've seen, the cemeteries are fairly close to the church. Our cemetery is about a mile east of here. It's up on a hill, which is a good thing because we get some good moisture here sometimes. It's original, and it used to be split in two. It was actually had a fence right down the middle. The south side was for the Protestant church, and the north side was for the Catholic church. And years ago, we started having fundraisers to replace the barbed wire fence and the old posts that were originally there. And so we went with chain link fence and stuff. And I made a suggestion. I said, you know what? We lived with these people. We had dinner with them. We helped them. They helped us. We're a community. What's this fence in the middle about? We could still have some sort of indicator or a sign or something that, you know, Protestants on this side, Catholics on this side, but, you know, when you're dead, you're dead. You're just a dead human being. And they agreed, you know, there's no need for this. So that fence was removed. In the early 80s, there was a windstorm and a pretty serious snowstorm, and it blew a lot of the shingles off. And the original roof is 1-bys, which is called 1-by. They're all different widths, but there's gaps in between the two, and so quite a bit of water got in and it damaged the ceiling, and the floor was redone. But it's the original floor it's probably from the mid-60s, I would say, is when they put this hardwood floor in. But the benches were slightly damaged as well. So Father Pat and some of the parishioners commissioned somebody in Taos to make these benches for them. And we have a couple of the original benches out in our little gazebo, which I'm glad they were able to keep. One thing that I do miss is the original Stations of the Cross. I think what makes this mission church unique, San Ysidro, like I mentioned before, is a patron saint of the farmer. And so in belief, you know, a lot of people, they'll come to Mass here from afar, from San Acacio, from New Mexico, just to ask San Ysidro to help us with our crops and our summers. And I've had this conversation with a lot of people, and they'll ask me, well, why do you Catholics pray to saints? You're not supposed to pray to saints. There's only one Savior. You know, we don't pray to saints. We ask saints to help us. They're like a mediator, or, you know, they're an in-between mediator between us and God and Christ. And they set an example for us to follow. And to me, San Ysidro is one who set the perfect example. I think the most important lesson is just keeping the faith. Keeping the faith, and it's not an easy thing to do, but it's something that in my heart, it's a must. And not just keeping the faith, but showing our kids and our grandkids that this has been our way of life forever. And you have that connection. You have that connection to this place. This place is healing in many ways. You know, it's peaceful, it's quiet, and it has a lot of riches that have nothing to do with money. And I think those are the values that I think are very important, not only for our families, but for the future of this nation.
I'm really excited to be able to tell this story because my family is actually from San Acacio. We are in the Church of San Acacio, which is the oldest standing church in Colorado. The church in Guadalupe, which is outside of Conejos in Antonito, Colorado, still wears the belt as the oldest church. But the real history is that this church was built 10 years prior to that church. So the Church of Our Lady of Guadalupe was actually built in 1866, and this church was built in 1856. The story of this church is really incredible, and it's actually kind of mythical in how the name San Acacio and why this church was built here in Thanksgiving for San Acacio, who was Saint Acacius. Saint Acacius was actually an Armenian 4th century priest who was known for a lot of different things, but he was actually the patron saint of warriors. So 1851 is when the first permanent establishment of San Luis was created. And then right afterwards, some say the exact same year, some say in 1852, San Pedro to the east and San Acacio to the west were the next two that were formed. But this wasn't even called San Acacio yet. They made the little placita, which we can see right to the west of this church here. And the only thing that stood on this particular grounds was an oratorio, which is basically an oratorium where an orator would come and give a speech. The oratorio is where the friars would come and give masses at that time. And it was a very small little building. It is not exactly where this is. It's just a little bit further east on the same piece of property. So this piece of land is really incredible. There are actually people who are buried underneath the church. One theory is that the church didn't even exist here. There was the oratorio in the back, and this is where they first started burying people, probably around the early 1850s. And then the church was built, and then back behind the church still exists the Camposanto, which is the Spanish word for cemetery. So one other thing I wanted to point out that is very different about this church and unique about this church is the altar. So if you see the altar behind me, it is very much New Mexico style, not even necessarily Spanish style and not even necessarily Mexican architecture. This is very much a New Mexico sort of type thing. The wood floors are actually local beetle kill that was donated to the church, and all of the woodwork were done by local artisans. So everything that's in here was hand carved. It was placed by hand. Every nail was nailed with an actual hammer. So they didn't have some kind of a machine that came in and put the flooring in and put up the top. Every single church has a certain family who are called mayordomos, who their lifelong passion and their real career is for their existence to take care of these churches.
The Iglesia de San Francisco de Asís. It was constructed in 1960. This church is a distinct representation amongst the Culebra rural villages constructed not of adobe but of concrete block, yet exhibiting the vernacular character defining features sympathetic with its fellow mission churches of earlier construction. Also an enclosed variable twin bell towers with a pyramid roof, front gable, nave roof. The church sits at the western entrance of the small unincorporated village of San Francisco, also known as La Valley or El Rito, over 9 miles southeast of San Luis on County Road J2. The church was constructed at the behest of Padre Onofre Madrigal and designed by one of the assistant pastors, Pedro Verde. The Iglesia de San Francisco de Asís is significant for Hispanic heritage as a central gathering place for the community of San Francisco. To this day, the church remains a location for ongoing cultural use and a set of regular community gatherings. During the summer, a priest from Sangre de Cristo parish conducts a mass in Spanish at the local mission church in the area. I'm Charlie Maestas. I was born in Pueblo, Colorado, where my dad used to work at the steel mill, and I'm 74 years old, and I was born on February 27th, 1948. This church was built traditionally like the other churches that were built around the area, with the steeples and the bell. The windows and stuff like that are a lot different than the other churches. They got the ones that got these are clear windows. Describing the front of the church, one's got the justice towers and the bell towers, and if you look up on top of the balcony right there, that's where the piano is. That's where they play the chorus, you know. There's a piano up on top, and the bell rope is right there, so, on the corner, where the steeple is. It's a real nice place to come and visit, and I wish people would probably, you know, not come to church necessarily, but at least come and look at the church and appreciate the building and stuff like that, you know. So if people will come down and come and visit and stuff like that, you know, be glad to open the doors for them so you can come and look at it or stuff like that. When I was younger, there was a lot of people in this community used to come to this church. This church used to get filled up with people, and there was real community getting together, friends and family. What I enjoyed is the community getting together, doing different activities together, praying together, the kids running around, playing. I enjoyed all that kind of stuff. And I kind of grew up in this church, and I'm really proud of it, and I try to do the best thing I can to keep it going. It was falling apart, and they got the Knights of Columbus came down and helped us kind of redo the outside of it, because it was really, really bad. And I had applied to the Historical Society, but it took too long, and it was falling apart, so I kind of did all the work. I repainted it, did the steeples on the top, and did all kinds of stuff. And so I'm proud of the church. I'm trying to, you know, keep it as long as I can.
Starting in Mexico, right around the 12th of December, which is kicked off by the feast day of Our Lady of Guadalupe. In Mexico, they used to do Las Posadas, which is the reenactment of when Joseph and Mary were going and knocking at all the inns to try to find a place to go in, because Mary was about to give birth and they needed to be inside somewhere. And so Las Posadas is a reenactment of that, and it's happened all the way since Mexico, but it's a tradition that we still keep here, mostly in Chama, in Fort Garland, and in San Acacio. So that reenactment is really true to what the story said, how Joseph and Mary came. So we get ourselves a young Joseph and a young Mary, and we get ourselves a burro, which is a donkey that they Mary is on top of the donkey, obviously, and Joseph leads it. Musicians and people from the parishes come behind them, and we sing the traditional song, which is still sung in Mexico.
One of the traditions, especially during Holy Week, is the penitentes from the Moradas. They participate in prayers, and they have a vigil, and they'll walk from a certain distance. And the 15th of May is Patriot San Ysidro Day, and so we still had this year had a mass scheduled here, and we walked with the penitentes from about a quarter mile down the road. And we carried San Ysidro, and we switched off, and we walked him in here, and it was just a very beautiful, very emotional, very loving time. And I think it was just such a blessing, because we had so much wind all week long, and it was just really horrible. And I'm like, well, if God and San Ysidro will permit, we'll have either a nice calm day, or we'll have to do this in the storm, you know. And that day was just amazing. The sun was out, the wind was still. It was just like if It hadn't been windy or anything for, days, weeks. And we had that procession. And as we had the procession, and as we were getting here close to the gate, when our next door neighbor here, he rang the church bell. Whew. That was sweet. People, unfortunately, have forgotten a little bit about it, but I can honestly tell you that all the families from here, and especially in Costilla County, they still hold a very deep connection to those long family traditions. And ever since I left, I went to Denver after I graduated from high school. I wanted to just be gone for a couple of years, make enough money to come home and build a house. Well, here we are. That was in 1976. But thank God I carried this place with me in my heart. And there's been so many times when I just thought, I'm calling it quits. But something always drew me, and the remembrance of this church had such a strong hold on me that I always wanted to do something special for it. And so I just, want to preserve this mission church as not just to continue to teach the faith of God and Jesus, but so that we don't forget what people went through just to get us where we are now. I think it's just a dishonor to let it go to waste. And so, there's a lot of other faiths that have come about, and that's fine because they're all adoring and professing Jesus Christ as our Savior, and that's awesome. And so I just still believe that these mission churches play an honest role in our society today.